They said he was a monster, a black shadow made of muscle and pure, unbridled rage. 32 men, the toughest, most seasoned cowboys in the territory, had tried to break the stallion they called Storm. Every single one of them left the dirt with nothing but bruised bones and shattered pride. But then, a dusty stagecoach rolled into the Iron Creek Ranch. Out stepped Nora Vance, a woman with nothing but a small carpetbag and a secret way of speaking to the wild. The rich rancher laughed at her. He dared her to even touch the beast that had defeated an army of men. He didn't realize that Nora wasn't there to break a horse. She was there to heal a soul.
Welcome back to Rescued by the Ridge. Today, we bring you a sweeping tale of grit, patience, and the power of a quiet heart. If you believe that kindness is stronger than force, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. Now let's travel back to the high country of 1884.
The dust of the Oregon Trail stayed in your lungs long after the stagecoach moved on. Nora Vance stood at the edge of the Iron Creek Ranch, watching the wheels disappear into the golden haze of the valley. It was the autumn of 1884. The air here smelled of mountain pine, dry grass, and a restless energy that seemed to vibrate in the very ground beneath her boots. She adjusted the strap of her worn carpetbag. Nora didn't look like the typical mail-order brides who arrived from the east. Her dress was a simple, sturdy wool, gray as a mountain mist. Her hands weren't soft or pale. They were the hands of a woman who had survived the high ridges of the north, hands that knew the texture of bark and the cold bite of river water. "You're later than the letter said." The voice was like grinding stone. Nora turned to see a man standing on the wide, shaded porch of the ranch house, Caleb Thorne. He was tall, dressed in fine leather, with eyes that looked like they hadn't enjoyed a sunset in years. He didn't come down the steps to help her with her bag. He just stood there, silhouetted against the massive timber frame of his empire. "The mud in the past doesn't care about schedules, Mr. Thorne," Nora replied. Her voice was steady. It wasn't the voice of a woman who was easily intimidated by wealth or stature. Caleb looked her over. He saw the dust on her hem and the lack of fine jewelry. He sighed, a heavy, weary disappointment. "I asked the agency for a woman to manage this house, to bring some order to this chaos. You look like you've spent your life chasing sheep in the brush." Nora didn't flinch. She looked him right in the eye. "I can manage a house, sir, but I can also manage a life. There is a difference between the two." Before Caleb could offer a sharp retort, a sound sliced through the mountain air. It wasn't a whistle or a worker's call. It was a scream. It was a high, piercing, agonizing sound of a creature in total despair. It came from the far corrals, past the bunkhouses where the dust was thickest. It was the sound of a spirit being pushed to the ultimate breaking point. Nora's head snapped toward the noise. Her eyes narrowed and her posture changed instantly. She forgot about the cold rancher. She forgot about her heavy bag. She felt that scream in her own chest, vibrating like a struck bell. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice tight. Caleb's face darkened. He looked toward the dust cloud rising from the distant pens. "That," he said, his voice dropping to a low, bitter growl, "is the reason 32 men are currently nursing wounds in the bunkhouse, and the reason I'm about to lose a fortune on a beast that cannot be tamed." Nora didn't wait for an invitation. She dropped her bag in the dirt and started walking toward the scream. Nora didn't run, but her stride was purposeful. Each step took her closer to the chaos. Caleb Thorne followed behind, his heavy spurs clicking rhythmically against the hard-packed earth. He shouted for her to stop, but the wind swallowed his words. As Nora reached the heavy timber rails of the main corral, the scene before her made her heart ache. In the center of the ring was a stallion the color of a midnight storm. He was magnificent, with a chest as broad as a barrel and a mane that flowed like ink. But his beauty was masked by his terror. The horse was lathered in white sweat, his nostrils flared until they showed the bright panicked red of his inner skin. A group of ranch hands stood outside the fence, clutching ropes and long wooden poles. They looked exhausted and angry. One man, a burly fellow named Jeb, spat into the dust. "He's a devil, boss," Jeb called out, not seeing Nora at first. "He nearly took my thumb off when I tried to snub him to the post. He's got no bottom to his rage." Nora leaned against the fence. She wasn't looking at the men. She was watching the horse's eyes. Most people see a crazy horse and see a threat. Nora saw something else. She saw a creature that was reacting to the world exactly how it had been taught. If you treat a living thing like a monster, it will eventually believe you. "He isn't a devil," Nora said, her voice cutting through the men's grumbling. The cowboys turned, startled. Jeb laughed, a harsh sound. "And what would a lady in a travel-worn dress know about a man-killer like Storm? This horse has sent 32 riders into the dirt. Some of them didn't get back up for a week." Caleb stepped up beside her, his arms crossed over his chest. "Jeb is right, Nora. That stallion cost me more than a small herd of cattle, and so far he's been nothing but a liability. We've tried everything. We tried the ropes, we tried the hobbles, we even tried keeping him in the dark to settle his nerves. Nothing works." Nora felt a flash of heat in her soul. "You tried to break his will before you tried to earn his trust," she said softly. She looked at Caleb, her eyes steady. "In the mountains, we have a saying. A horse broken by fear is just a bomb waiting for a spark. But a horse that chooses to follow you, that's a partner for life." Caleb looked at the stallion, then back at the small, determined woman. A slow, mocking smile crept onto his face. He didn't believe her for a second. "You talk a fine game, Miss Vance, but talk is cheap in the West. You want to stay on this ranch? You want to prove you're more than just a housekeeper?" He pointed a gloved finger at the thrashing horse. "The dare is this. Train him. Make him rideable. If you can do what 32 men couldn't, you'll have a place here as long as you want. But if you fail, if you can't even get near him by the end of the week, you take the next coach back to where you came from." Nora looked at the stallion. Storm let out another defiant scream, kicking the heavy rails until the wood groaned. It was an impossible task, but Nora didn't hesitate. "I don't need a week to get near him. I'll start tomorrow at sunrise, but under one condition. No ropes, no poles, and none of your men are allowed to touch him. From now on, his life belongs to me."
The sun hadn't yet cleared the jagged peaks of the ridge when Nora stepped out onto the porch. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of frost and dry pine needles. Most of the ranch hands were already gathered by the corral, leaning against the rails with tin cups of coffee. They weren't there to help. They were there to watch the city woman fail. Caleb Thorne stood apart from the rest, his hat pulled low. He watched Nora approach, expecting her to carry a heavy lariat or perhaps a weighted whip. Instead, she carried a simple wooden stool and a small leather-bound journal. "Where's your gear?" Jeb called out, a smirk playing on his weathered face. "That horse is liable to eat that stool for breakfast, lady." Nora didn't answer. She didn't even look at him. She unlatched the heavy gate of the round pen and stepped inside. The moment the latch clicked, Storm transformed. The stallion had been standing in the far corner, but now he exploded into motion. He hammered his hooves into the dirt, circling the perimeter like a cyclone of black fur and fury. The cowboys flinched back from the rails, but Nora did something that made the entire group gasp. She walked directly to the center of the pen, placed her stool in the dirt, and sat down. She didn't look at the horse. She didn't shout. She simply opened her journal and began to read silently. This is a technique often called passive persistence. In the world of natural horsemanship, a horse is a prey animal. Their entire survival depends on detecting intent. When the cowboys entered the pen with ropes and sweat, they smelled like predators. They were hunters trying to capture a kill. But Nora was offering the horse something he had never experienced from a human: total indifference. Storm charged. He thundered toward the center of the pen, his head low, teeth bared. It was a bluff meant to send any predator running. Caleb reached for his holster, his heart leaping into his throat. "Nora, get out!" he barked. Nora didn't move. She didn't even lift her eyes from the page. She kept her breathing rhythmic and deep, her body language radiating a calm, grounded energy. At the very last second, Storm veered off, kicking a cloud of dust over her dress. He circled again, confused. For 2 hours, the dance continued. The horse ran, screamed, and threatened. Nora remained a statue of peace. Slowly, the stallion's gallop slowed to a trot, then a walk. His ears, which had been pinned flat against his skull, began to flicker forward. He was curious. For the first time in his life, the human in the pen wasn't a hunter. Nora whispered under her breath, not to the horse, but to the wind. "The wild doesn't want to fight you, Storm. It just wants to know it's safe." Caleb watched from the fence, his coffee gone cold in his hand. He had spent his whole life fighting for everything he owned. He had never considered that some things could only be won by surrendering the fight.
By midday, the high desert sun was baking the arena, but no one had moved. The cowboys, who usually spent their noon hour playing cards or sleeping, were leaning over the rails in a stunned silence. They were witnessing something that defied every rule of the Old West. Storm had stopped running. He stood 20 feet away from Nora, his chest heaving, his coat damp with sweat. For the first time, his eyes weren't rolling back in fear. He was watching the woman on the stool. Nora finally closed her journal. She stood up slowly. No sudden movements, no reaching out. "Now," she whispered, her voice carrying in the still air, "we start to talk." Nora began to use the join-up method, a cornerstone of natural horsemanship that relies on the horse's own social language. She didn't use a bit or a spur, she used her shoulders. When she turned her body directly toward Storm's eye, she was applying mental pressure, telling him to move. When he moved, she immediately softened her gaze and turned her shoulder away. This is the educational secret of the ridge: pressure and release. In the wild, a lead mare doesn't use teeth to lead, she uses space. Nora was showing Storm that she could control his movement without ever laying a hand on him. Every time he took a step toward her, she rewarded him by looking away, giving him the comfort he craved. The tension in the corral was thick enough to cut. Nora began to walk in a small circle, her back to the stallion. This was the ultimate sign of trust. She was telling the predator killer that she didn't fear him, and more importantly, that he had no reason to fear her. A soft fluttering sound broke the silence. Storm blew out a long, deep breath, what horsemen call a sigh of release. It's the sound of a horse's nervous system switching from flight mode to follow mode. Step by step, the black stallion began to close the gap. He wasn't charging, he was drifting. His nose stretched out, sniffing the air, catching the scent of the lavender soap Nora used. The men on the fence held their breath. Jeb gripped the railing so hard his knuckles turned white. Caleb Thorne felt a lump in his throat. He had spent years trying to command respect through power, but here was a woman who was gaining it through humility. Just as Storm's velvet nose was inches from Nora's shoulder, a sudden metallic clang echoed from the blacksmith shop nearby.
Storm bolted, his hooves throwing dirt into the air. The progress seemed shattered in a second, but Nora didn't flinch. She simply stood her ground, waiting to see if the bridge they had built was strong enough to hold.
The metallic clang of the blacksmith's hammer hung in the air like a threat. Storm had retreated to the far rail, his muscles quivering, ready to revert to the wild creature he had been an hour ago. The cowboys groaned, certain the spell was broken. But Nora remained still. She didn't chase him. She knew that in the wild, the leader never chases, the leader waits. Slowly, the stallion's ears flicked back toward her. He saw that she hadn't moved. He saw that the danger hadn't resulted in a whip or a rope. With a cautious, rhythmic step, he returned to her side, lowering his head in a gesture of submission. That evening, as the purple shadows of the ridge stretched across the valley, Caleb Thorne found Nora by the well. She was washing the dust from her face, her movements slow and weary. For the first time, Caleb didn't look at her as a housekeeper or a gamble. He looked at her with genuine wonder. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "I've hired men from Texas to Montana. They all use the rough-out method, breaking the spirit to save the horse. You're doing something else entirely." Nora dried her hands and looked toward the high peaks. "My father was a tracker in the northern ridges," she began. "He spent more time with elk and wolves than he did with people. He taught me that every living thing has a circle of safety. If you force your way inside it, they'll fight to the death. But if you wait at the edge, they will eventually invite you in." She looked at Caleb, her eyes reflecting the dying embers of the sunset. "Storm isn't mean, Mr. Thorne. He's just been crowded his whole life. He spent 32 men's worth of time defending his circle. He's tired of fighting. Are you?" The question caught Caleb off guard. He thought of his massive ranch, the walls he had built around his emotions since his wife had passed, and the way he demanded absolute obedience from everyone he employed. He realized he had been trying to break his own life into submission, just like he had tried to break that horse. "I suppose I am," Caleb admitted, his gaze dropping to the dirt. "A horse is a mirror," Nora said gently. "They don't react to who you want to be. They react to who you are in that moment. If you are frustrated, they are anxious. If you are at peace, they are calm." This is the deeper educational value of the ridge, emotional regulation. To work with a 1,000-pound animal, a human must first master their own heartbeat. As the stars began to poke through the velvet sky, a new understanding formed between the rancher and the bride. But the peace was short-lived. In the shadows of the bunkhouse, Jeb watched them, his jaw set in a hard line. He didn't believe in mirrors or circles. He believed in iron, and he was planning to prove it. The night was not silent. A heavy, oppressive heat had settled over the valley, the kind that makes the cattle restless and the air taste of copper. Far off in the distance, the sky over the ridge began to flicker with an eerie, silent light. A mountain storm was brewing, and it was moving fast. By midnight, the silence was shattered. A crack of thunder ripped through the air, vibrating the very floorboards of the ranch house. In the stables, the horses began to whinny in distress, but one sound rose above the rest, the frantic, rhythmic thud of a heavy body slamming against wood. Storm was panicking. For a wild Mustang, being trapped in a small wooden stall during a storm is a nightmare. The lightning flashes looked like predators' eyes, and the thunder sounded like the world collapsing. Jeb, the foreman, was already out there. He had never liked Nora's soft ways, and he saw the horse's terror as a sign of failure. He grabbed a heavy bull rope and a lantern, his face twisted in frustration. "I told the boss, a wild one like this needs to be tied down or he'll kill himself and take the barn with him." Nora reached the barn just as Jeb was sliding the bolt to Storm's stall.
The stallion was a blur of black motion, rearing up and striking the rafters. "Jeb, stop!" Nora shouted over the wind. "If you rope him now, his heart will give out. You'll break his neck." "Move aside, woman," Jeb growled, stepping into the stall with the rope coiled. But Storm didn't see a helper. He saw a captor. He lunged, not out of malice, but out of a blind need to escape. Jeb had to dive out of the way, dropping the lantern. The glass shattered, and for a terrifying moment, the hay flickered with a small flame. Nora grabbed a burlap sack and smothered the spark before it could spread, but the damage was done. Storm was now completely unhinged, backed into a corner, his breath coming in jagged, sobbing gasps. Caleb appeared in the doorway, his coat drenched from the rain. He saw the rope in Jeb's hand and the terror in the horse's eyes. He looked at Nora. He had a choice: go back to the old way of force or trust the woman who spoke to the wild. "Get out, Jeb," Caleb ordered, his voice low and cold. "But boss," "I said out." Nora didn't wait. She didn't take a rope. She stepped into the stall, the smell of burnt hay and wet horse thick in the air. She didn't try to grab him. She simply slumped her shoulders and sat on the floor in the corner, far from his hooves. She began to hum, a low, vibrating tone her father had used to calm hunting dogs. The storm roared outside, but inside the stall, Nora became the only still thing in the world. She was teaching the most important lesson of the Ridge. A leader is the person who remains calm when everyone else is screaming.
The storm eventually moved on, leaving only the steady, rhythmic dripping of rainwater from the eaves. Inside the stall, the air was thick and humid. Nora hadn't moved from her spot on the floor. Her low humming had trailed off into a soft, melodic whisper, a lullaby of the high country. Storm was no longer throwing himself against the walls. He stood in the center of the stall, his head dropped low, a sign of total mental exhaustion and growing trust. His sides were still stained with dried sweat, but his breathing had synced with Nora's. Nora rose slowly, her back sliding up against the wooden slats. She didn't reach for his head. In the world of horses, the nose and the eyes are the most sensitive areas, often protected at all costs. Instead, she moved her hand toward his shoulder, the place where horses in a herd lean against one another for comfort. When her fingers finally met his coat, Storm flinched, a ripple of muscle sliding beneath his skin, but he didn't move away. Nora began to scratch him firmly, mimicking the way a lead mare uses her teeth to groom a subordinate. This is called allo-grooming. It releases endorphins in a horse, lowering their heart rate and creating a chemical bond of friendship. "There it is," Nora whispered. "Just a horse, not a monster. Just a tired boy a long way from home." She moved her hand upward, sliding it along the strong curve of his neck. Storm closed his eyes. His lower lip began to droop and quiver, a sure sign that he was entering a state of deep relaxation. This wasn't a broken horse. This was a horse that had finally found a safe harbor. Caleb Thorne was still standing in the shadows of the barn aisle. He watched as Nora leaned her forehead against the stallion's powerful neck. He had never seen anything so fragile and so strong at the same time. He realized then that Nora wasn't just training the horse to be useful, she was restoring its dignity. "I didn't think it was possible," Caleb said, his voice barely a whisper. He stepped closer, but stopped when Storm's ears flicked back. "He's learning to trust again, Caleb," Nora said, not turning around. "But trust is like glass. It takes a long time to build and only a second to shatter. He's ready for the next step, but the men, they won't like it.
They want to see a saddle. Nora turned then, her eyes meeting Caleb's. But a saddle is just leather and wood. What he needs now is a promise. Caleb looked at the horse, then at Nora's tired, mud-streaked face. For the first time, the wealthy rancher felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years: hope. But as the first light of dawn began to gray the horizon, the sound of Jeb's heavy boots echoed on the gravel outside. The week was almost up, and the final challenge was looming.
The morning sun brought a cold, biting clarity to the Iron Creek Ranch. It was the final day of the dare. Word had spread through the valley like a brush fire. A mail-order bride was claiming she had tamed the Iron Creek Devil without a single rope. By 8 o'clock, neighbors and rival ranchers had lined their wagons along the fence line. They didn't come to see a success. They came to see the moment the illusion shattered. Jeb stood at the center of the crowd, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. He was the voice of the old world, a world that believed dominion was something you took by force. "Touching a horse in a dark stall is one thing," Jeb announced to the onlookers, his voice loud and mocking. "But a ranch needs a horse that can work. If that beast won't take a bit in a saddle, he's just an expensive pet. And Mr. Thorne doesn't run a sanctuary." Caleb Thorne stood on his porch, caught between two worlds. He looked at the crowd, then at the barn doors. He felt the weight of his reputation. In the Old West, a man's worth was often tied to the discipline of his land and his livestock. If Nora failed today, Caleb wouldn't just lose a horse, he would lose the respect of every man in the territory. Nora emerged from the barn, but she didn't look like a woman heading for a showdown. She looked at peace. She carried no heavy western saddle, no iron bit, and no spurs. In her hand she held only a simple rope halter she had braided herself from soft cotton. "You're really going through with this?" Caleb asked as she passed. His voice was thick with a sudden sharp anxiety. "Nora, look at them. They're waiting for him to throw you. You don't have to do this for them." Nora stopped and looked up at him. "I'm not doing it for them, Caleb, and I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it for Storm. He needs to know that he can carry the weight of a human without losing his soul." The educational truth of the Ridge is that a horse's back is a sacred space. In nature, the only thing that jumps on a horse's back is a predator trying to kill it. To ask a horse to carry a rider is to ask it to overcome its deepest evolutionary instinct. As Nora stepped into the sunlight of the main corral, the whispering died down. The air became heavy and still. Storm was led out into the center of the ring. He looked different now, cleaner, calmer, but as he saw the crowd and heard the murmurs, his ears began to pin back. He could feel the doubt of 30 men pressing in on him. Nora walked straight to him, ignoring the gallery of skeptics. She knew that if her heart rate climbed even a single beat, Storm would feel it. The shadow of doubt was everywhere, but in the center of that ring, there was only one truth left to prove. The silence in the corral was so heavy it felt as if the wind itself had stopped to watch. Nora stood by Storm's side, her hand resting lightly on his withers. She could feel the vibration of his heart, a fast, staccato rhythm. He was on the edge. One wrong move, one sharp shout from the crowd, and the progress of the last week would vanish in a storm of hooves and dust. Nora didn't reach for a mountain block. She didn't have a saddle to grip. Instead, she spent a long moment just breathing with the horse, matching her exhalations to his. She was practicing what modern trainers call grounding. By keeping her own central nervous system calm, she acted as an anchor for the stallion's fear. "Watch this," Jeb whispered loudly from the fence, his eyes gleaming with a dark anticipation. "He's gonna launch her into the next county." Nora ignored him. She placed her left hand in Storm's mane and leaned her weight against his side. She didn't jump, she flowed. In one smooth, liquid motion, she pulled herself up. She didn't sit upright immediately. She lay across his back, allowing him to feel her weight without the predatory silhouette of a human sitting tall. Storm tensed, his skin rippled, and his legs locked like iron pillars.
This was the moment of truth. If he was going to buck, it would be now. The crowd leaned forward, eyes wide. But Nora didn't squeeze with her legs. She didn't pull on the rope. She simply stayed soft, her body draped over him like a familiar blanket. Slowly, she sat up. She felt Storm's back arch slightly. Then, with a long, shuddering sigh, he relaxed. He didn't fight the weight. He accepted it. "Walk on," Nora whispered, shifting her seat bones just a fraction of an inch forward. To the amazement of every man watching, the man-killer took a step, then another. There was no bit in his mouth, no steel in his sides. He was moving because Nora was asking him to, not forcing him. They moved in a perfect rhythmic circle around the corral. It wasn't the frantic, jagged movement of a broken horse. It was the graceful, coordinated walk of a partner. Nora guided him toward the gate. With a steady hand, she signaled Caleb to open it. The rancher moved as if in a trance, swinging the heavy timber wide. Nora rode Storm out of the confines of the pen and into the open yard, heading straight toward the ridge. She wasn't just riding a horse, she was demonstrating the ultimate educational value of the Old West, that true leadership is the art of making the right thing easy and the wrong thing difficult. Caleb watched him go, his eyes stinging. He had spent his life building fences to keep things in, but Nora had just shown him that the greatest things are found when you finally let the gates swing open.
The sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks, painting the Oregon sky in strokes of violet and bruised gold. Nora rode Storm back into the ranch yard, her silhouette long and graceful against the cooling earth. As she approached the main house, she didn't see a crowd of skeptics anymore. The neighbors had gone, their hushed whispers replaced by a profound, respectful silence that hung over the Iron Creek. She slid off Storm's back, her boots hitting the dirt with a soft thud. The stallion didn't bolt. He simply lowered his head, nudging her shoulder with his velvet nose, asking for the touch he had learned to crave. Nora rubbed the bridge of his nose, her eyes reflecting the peace of the high country. Caleb Thorne stepped off the porch. He didn't look like the cold, hardened man who had met her at the stagecoach. He looked like a man who had finally seen a glimpse of a life he thought was lost forever. He walked up to Storm, and for the first time, he didn't reach for the horse with a sense of ownership. He reached out with a sense of wonder. "You did it," Caleb whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You didn't just train him, Nora. You saved him." "We saved him," Nora corrected gently, looking at Caleb. "You gave him the chance. You chose to trust me when everything you knew told you not to. That's where the healing starts." In the world of the Old West, redemption wasn't found in gold or land. It was found in the moments when the wild met the weary, and both found rest. Caleb realized that his ranch was no longer just a business of cattle and commerce. It was a sanctuary. He looked at Nora, the woman who had arrived with nothing but a bag and a quiet heart, and he knew he couldn't let her leave. "The week is up," Caleb said, his gaze steady on hers. "The dare is won, but I don't want you to stay because of a bet. I want you to stay because this ridge, it's finally found its soul." He reached out and took her hand, the hand that had calmed the storm. Around them, the ranch settled into a new kind of quiet. The men in the bunkhouse were talking in low, softened tones, and the bitter tension that had gripped the Iron Creek for years had finally broken. They weren't just a rancher and a bride anymore. They were the beginning of a family, forged in the fires of patience and the soft breath of a wild stallion. As the first stars blinked into existence, Nora looked toward the ridge. The man-killer was now a partner, and the lonely rancher was now a man with a future. Love, it seemed, was the only thing in the West that couldn't be broken, only invited in.
Thank you for joining us for this journey of redemption at Rescued by the Ridge. Nora and Storm's story reminds us that even the wildest hearts can find peace when met with patience instead of force.
If this story touched your heart, please give it a like and share it with someone who needs a reminder that it's never too late for a new beginning. We'd love to hear from you. What part of Nora's journey resonated with you the most? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and check out our playlist for more tales of the Old West, mountain men, and the enduring spirit of the frontier. Until next time, stay grounded, stay kind, and may your own trail lead you home. Take care.